Zoom interface. Here we go. Okay, we are recording. This is the Object Bucket Storage Interface Kep Review 3, held on March 18th. So I am John Cope, and I'm co-presenting here with Jeff Vance. We are colleagues from Red Hat presenting the Object Bucket Storage API Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal. This time we are going to be going over, let me go ahead and share screen here, the block of changes between that occurred between this meeting and the previous one. And let me know, please, if you can see my Chrome window here.
Yep.
All right, is that readable for people?
Yep, looks good.
Excellent, okay. So you'll also find in the chat window a kind of on-the-fly agenda for things we want to call out. And as usual, please feel free at any moment to interrupt me, ask questions, make critiques and comments, and we can carry the discussion forward from there. I'd much rather do it like that than people hold it until the end. It's just easier to address it when it's front of mind. So first thing I'd like to cover, we made API name changes. So the CRDs are no longer bucket, Object Bucket Claim and Object Bucket. They are now respectively Bucket and Bucket Content, in the same vein as volume snapshots and volume snapshot contents. And if that doesn't raise any hairs on anyone on the back of anyone's neck.
Yeah, let's. That's a big change. There's been some comfort around saying OBC. There was a bit of a analogy with PVC, but it's been raised that claim shouldn't be in the name. You know, you don't do a pod claim because you want an app container. So what do you guys think about the name change?
I'm fine with it. This is Andrew.
Yep.
Okay, that's good. I know it was a bit of a lukewarm debate about it to begin with, so I think we're good there. Yeah, so the next big point of contention, I think, was namespacing and how we were segregating drivers and API objects. And so part of that change has included the cluster scoping of bucket classes and bucket content objects. So those are no longer namespace, meaning that you know, drivers, regardless of where they are, will be reading objects at the cluster scope. The consensus in the last couple of meetings seemed to be that that was okay. The pattern already exists in Kubernetes and works well and does not contain any security concerns as of yet. And
So I guess the open issue then is the whole cozy name, the cozy system namespace, whether that's all drivers go into that or not. There was some concern about that.
yes, thank you. Yeah, sorry, I was kind of brain fart for a sec. So we would like to get some agreement today, if at all possible, on whether or not drivers should be clumped together in a single namespace or if they should be deployed in discrete namespaces, bearing in mind that the parent secrets or the original secrets from which the data is cloned into the user namespace in a user secret will still live in the namespace, in the same namespace as the driver.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Why would that be the case instead of non-namespace? Oh, because secrets can't be non-namespaced. Yeah.
Right. So the two scenarios then are, one, if everything's in the cozy namespace, one driver can read all the secrets in that namespace. That doesn't seem ideal. The other option, of course, discriminating drivers by namespace, meaning that they only have access to the secrets they themselves create for the object store they themselves represent.
That seems reasonable to me. Separate driver namespaces.
Okay. In terms of like the mental or administrative overhead, there was some concerns about that. But Jeff and I feel that the security concerns kind of outweigh that.
Yeah, and the thing about that is that you can still do very driver-centric RBAC, right? So it's not like the problem scales non-linearly.
Exactly, exactly. So yeah, we felt that it was somewhat trivial to manage it through RBAC even across namespaces. And it's especially easier now that the bucket content and the bucket classes are not cluster scoped. Okay, so another point that's come up in the discussion on the, sorry, go ahead.
Interrupting just before we get to the next big one. Those are some fairly large changes from the original Kep and from the library implementation as well. And I just wanted to give a chance for anyone else to chime in with their thoughts on if you like those, if you support those changes, or if you have a concern.
This is Luis. This is my first time coming to this, so I'm catching up. So please let me know if you guys already discussed it. But I'm just trying to come up with the word driver, and I'm coming from CSI. So in CSI, there's a single driver, and the secrets are all available to the single driver on any namespace. And this seems to be a little bit different than that. So I'm not saying yes or no. I'm just saying that it's different coming from CSI and me being brand new. So it's confusing to me.
Could you dig into that a little further? What you mean by single driver?
Yeah. So in CSI, when you install the driver, it's there is a driver that's installed on the way CSI works is there is a controller service, and that could be a single thing. Normally, it's there's a replica 3 or something of them just to make sure that they are available. But there is a lock on them. There's a leader election, and then there is the node services that actually do the attachment and the detachment of the volume, and they're on each node, right? On every node, like a daemon set. You could think about it that way. And they're needed there because the kubelet communicates with them to be able to say, I need you to attach this volume. So from a point of view of a vendor, when I create a CSI driver, I deploy it as a single thing, right? I deploy this CSI driver onto the Kubernetes system.
I think that's exactly what the model here is. So
Okay.
I'm sorry. So what I was trying to get at is you somehow made a distinction between one, I assumed, and many, and I'm trying to understand what you think the issue is there.
Yeah, but when I mean many, they're not namespaced, right? They are things that Kubernetes communicates with, but the whole thing is not namespaced. And when you want to provision a volume through a storage class, and in the storage class you can specify that my secrets are available. My secrets are available in this namespace. The namespace your PVC is on. The sidecar container for the CSI class, it's non-namespaced either. It goes ahead and reads those secrets. What I'm trying to say is that the whole CSI system is not namespaced. So when you're describing this system to be namespace, it's a little bit confusing to me. And
so just to be clear, in the equivalent storage world, there are namespaced and non-namespaced bits, and then there are applications that get installed. So the namespaced bit, which would be the equivalent of the bucket in this case, is the PVC, right? And then the non-namespaced bits would be the storage class and the PV, which would be the equivalent of the bucket class and the bucket content here.
Got it.
And then if you install a particular CSI driver, many of those install into a vendor-specific namespace, right?
No, that's the part I'm confusing.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, at least all the ones that I've seen, they do. They as part of the installation media from that vendor, they say, oh, I have a foo namespace and my stuff goes in here.
Okay, but it doesn't have to be that way. You can go into Kube system. I'm just saying there's no definition around that.
Sure. Okay. So you're saying whether this should be suggested or normative.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I just, again, it was maybe that's the outcome that happened, but we never said you need to create a namespace and keep your drivers and sidecar containers on that. That was never said.
Right. That's fair. And honestly, if we were to implement the Cozy will have a very similar setup as Andrew was saying, where we have a central controller, and then the drivers deploy alongside sidecars. Of course, we don't need full node coverage because this is all over HTTP or
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
etc. So
Absolutely.
um,
Again, I'm coming in brand new, so I just wanted to bring.
It's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
That said, so in actual implementation, really the sidecar would just be written to look within its own namespace for secrets, and it's really up to the administrators where they put it at that point. Because
Okay.
I don't think we want to write logic for drivers to check for other drivers in the namespace, and then break if they exist. So really, an administrator could lump them all into the Cozy system namespace if they wanted to, or just some arbitrary driver namespace.
So one of the reasons why I think there is a discussion around this that may not be as common is that we're actually secrets in this case, and the naming of them and everything else is actually in scope of the standard instead of something just kind of, well, I guess with the storage stuff, it's pseudo standardized. But yeah, part of the concern is if you dump them all in the same namespace and you do an RBAC rule that says this driver can get at secrets in this namespace, you kind of inherently create a circumstance where a driver could look at the secrets generated or used by other drivers. And so that, I think that was part of the concern here, is to kind of not make that a sort of inherent weakness of this. So at least to suggest against that.
I see. Okay. I mean, sounds like a best practices kind of thing. That sounds good.
Right. Yeah. I think it's something we'd have to solve a documentation. And the other thing, there is something that I think we should try to solve. This may be getting a little too deep into like implementation, but programmatically, or maybe through the API, is maybe preventing drivers of drivers with the same name operating on the same objects. So, if I have two drivers and they're both named foo, they're both going to be looking for secrets tagged with foo and bucket content objects tagged with foo, and one of them may be an imposter, one of it just may be poor naming. But it does seem like there needs to be some sort of safeguard to stop two drivers with the same name accessing the same objects.
How does that work with PVCs? I mean, it seems like you'd have the same problem with CSI drivers.
I think what happens in CSI, I need to go back and read, but there's a registration mechanism.
Yeah.
That happens against the kubelet over gRPC. And I haven't looked deeply into it, but I have to imagine that the kubelet's doing some sort of like checking to make sure the name's not already taken or something. On our end, we don't have access to kubelet, so it'd be something the Cozy controller would do. And off the cuff, it seems like we would want maybe a registration object, provisional registration object or something that the Cozy controller would, it'd be created at the same time of the driver, but would be examined prior to driver operation starting by the Cozy controller. And then
we on the CSI side, we have a CSI driver object. It was optional on the CSI side. You could consider having something similar for Cozy and make it a requirement instead of optional. That way you have to create an object first to register your driver.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
And also these drivers in CSI are installed by the admin, not the user normally.
Right, it would be a CR that's part of the deployment of your driver. You're going to deploy a driver, a sidecar, and you'll probably deploy this registration object or a provisioner resource. And the Cozy controller will see that there's a new provisioner ready.
Yeah, you just have to make sure that that's only allowed by the admin, or that user with that RBAC.
Yeah, absolutely.
Agreed.
Yeah, otherwise you run into sort of a denial of service situation. Okay, so moving. Well, actually, sorry. Let me make note of that. Or is Jeff? Do you have that? Great. We retooled the greenfield, brownfield, and static workflows to more align with what we had talked about with Andrew and Saad on the side. That being greenfield, pure dynamic provisioning, pretty much as it was prior. Brownfield, the integration of existing buckets, but the provisioning of credentials via a driver for those buckets on demand. So it's the incorporation of a static bucket into a fully automated system. And then static bucket case, there is no driver. Excuse me. The bucket is, or the bucket content object is manually defined by an administrator. A secret is defined by the administrator in the in a namespace. The cozy controller would handle binding operations such that when a bucket object is created by a user, they have to, one, specify the bucket content directly. And then, well, actually, no, I'm sorry. I think sorry, let me restate that. A bucket class object would represent the backing object store bucket. The reason for doing this rather than defining a single bucket content object is that it allows us to maintain a one-to-one relationship between the user's bucket and the bucket content. It unburdens the administrator from having to create a bucket content object for every user that needs to, essentially for every namespace that needs to connect. Binding operations are minimal, and it really just entails copying the manually created secret to the namespace of the user. Now, we had a little bit of side conversation in email. I just want to make sure, especially with Sal and Andrew, that the system makes sense to y'all, and if it's something that we can move forward with.
I think the system completely makes sense. I share the one concern that I have shared all along and that Tim also brought up, which is that the static and brownfield case are very clearly existing bucket. The greenfield is very clearly Minta bucket. And in the Minta bucket case, I don't think it makes sense to give the full bucket name.
Yeah, I was just rereading those comments, and I'm glad you brought that up. So I am more or less ambivalent to the that implementation. I see y'all's point, particularly in that there is not a precedent for this in Kubernetes right now. If it's a dynamically created object, it's dynamically named.
So are you saying, John and Andrew, that through the S3 SDK or any other SDK, when I'm creating a new bucket, I cannot define its name?
No, not saying that. Saying that the problem is you don't know in a system that has many moving parts, and you're not supposed to know about the other parts. You don't know at the application level whether that bucket name is available, right? Whereas the whole point about the provisioning system is that you say, create a bucket for me and you'll get a bucket if I can fit one. It's just like temp file naming, right? In Unix, you never specify the actual temp file name because that creates a whole bunch of potential security issues and other things, right? There are race conditions involved and everything else. So the notion of fully specifying bucket name, at best, you have to deal with the failures of bucket already exists. And if you think about that failure case, how do you distinguish it between the item potency requirement and that?
Well, we
like
still have to
bucket
handle
to be created and it's already there, and you failed in the middle of the process and you come back up again. Was I the one that created the bucket?
Yeah,
I mean,
another good point.
Even with a generated name with a prefix, maybe the prefix is optional, we still need to handle the case where that the bucket name exists. So the code still has to handle that.
Sure, but you can imagine that most of those kind of cases will use this similar Kubernetes thing of generating pretty random hash components to make collision really unlikely.
Right. I mean, just using a UUID, you have like a 1 in a trillion chance of collision or something. So yeah, at that point, it's less of a concern. There's also the point, just to kind of pile on at this point, I guess, is you don't know how object stores react to a create bucket call. The big cloud providers, you do. Most of them, I think all three of them return a bucket exist error.
Okay.
But the smaller providers like Minio, EdgeFS, Ceph particularly will. I want to make sure I'm remembering this right, but you don't get a bucket exist error. It just like silently fails in the background.
That's not good, but
right. So you don't even know if you're succeeding or not sometimes.
Andrew, I like your TempFS analogy, and it makes sense. I want to push back on that just a little though. In a use case where I have coordinated applications, and one app will create the bucket, a new bucket, and another app's going to write to the bucket, and another app's going to read from the bucket, and they need to know the bucket name.
So you know what I'm going to say, right?
Well, I want to hear it.
It's brownfield, man.
The first one's greenfield. It's the idea of somehow sharing the name, and maybe it doesn't matter whether the name is a bunch of random characters or not.
I guess what I'm saying is that you have a couple of options. You could greenfield the first one, which means I'm still going to rely on the system to provision it, and then brownfield the next two, and now I know the name of the first one. Or you can just say, look, this kind of inter-application coordination is by definition an out-of-band problem. I just need to manually provision the bucket, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that was Tim's point.
Yeah, and I see brownfield being useful as a follow-on option anyway, because it's pretty easy to imagine that the second application, some front-end option, and you just want to get read access to the bucket. You may not want write access. So your brownfield operations, can allow you to hand out lesser privileged credentials to other components of your app.
Okay, just for people on the call, I'm trying to make notes. I think John is too, on this doc, on the agenda doc that is in the chat. The link is in the chat. I'm trying to keep kind of where there's decisions or consensus or a trend to consensus in the meeting. I'm trying to capture that here.
Okay, touch on another thing that was brought up by actually Tim in comments. He had mentioned using things other than secrets, specifically service accounts, to authenticate users so that they don't actually have to rely on secret credentials. That's a pretty alien notion to me, so we're still doing a lot of research on it. I was wondering if anyone had given this thought, or if it sounds like a reasonable additional feature to secrets, or what y'all's thoughts on it more generally.
So I guess the way that I would think about it is, if this were accessing another part of Kubernetes, we wouldn't need secrets, right?
Right.
We would just need the service accounts. And so I think what several folks are beginning to understand is dealing with two completely distinct authentication systems, one inside of Kubernetes and one outside, really creates a burden for users of Kubernetes, especially when you've got a cloud provider underneath it that already has all of that stuff. And so you have this problem of, how do you impedance match the in Kubernetes stuff with the outside of Kubernetes stuff? And things like secrets is just sidestepping that. And Tim's point is, at Google at least, we have been trying to provide a mechanism such that you can bind internal service accounts to an external representation. and that's clean enough that we expect that other cloud providers will do that also. So it isn't that this is instead of secrets. This is just, can we leave a provision so that if we expect that's the way things will evolve in some context moving forward, can we continue to make this usable for those rather than forcing the secret? That's all.
Yeah, yeah. That's going to come down to the implementation, making sure it's an extensible system.
I think that's really all that he was asking for.
Yeah, yeah. No, and that's about what I got out of it as well. As far as MVP, I'm not sure how much I want to like promise that it'll be part of the system.
Well, related to that, Andrew, I'll ask you, but I would sure like others to chime in with their opinions. Is based on Tim's comment in the Kep, and your comment, Andrew, are you suggesting we don't want secrets at all, or just we want alternatives also in addition?
Absolutely not suggesting that we don't want secrets. I think secrets are the ground zero must-have.
Okay.
I think it's just, we shouldn't spec our way into a box and say this will always be secrets. And so a head nod, and then I'm not also suggesting that it's absolutely generically extendable. His point was, we have a mechanism in Kubernetes to talk about this. Let's leverage either secrets or this internal mechanism, which is that's all.
Yeah, that seems perfectly reasonable to me, especially if that's where the looks like the future's going.
So John, you were going to ask about MVP then.
Yeah, I think Andrew may have answered my question
Yeah.
already in that Andrew, you had said that just at the outset give a head nod to the functionality, but maybe not include it right out of the gate.
Yeah, I get more worried about API stability and stuff like that. And if you introduce a union where there was a fixed field, then it causes backward compatibility issues. So if you can anticipate some of that stuff ahead of time, even if you only have the only option is secret, then you know what I mean? It's just kind of trying to make it forward proof. That's all.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All right. Beyond that, we can talk about actual API changes. I don't have anything else left on the agenda that was top of mind coming into this. And let me just refresh real quick. So we did a bit of renaming within the actual spec. Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, we're halfway into the meeting by a minute or two or more. The thought John and I had was that we would go through. There's some new fields in the API in the spec. A few changes here and there. It's sort of it's just the next level of detail. And I wondered before we did that if there's any more higher level concepts, because John and my understanding of this Kep process is that we converge and have consensus on the highest level goals and description of the API, and we then merge the Kep. And then the next level of detail would be a follow-on PR to provide more, the next couple of layers of the onion. I guess my one question is, for people who've gone through this process, is that correct on how it works? And then
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Sean from Google. I work with the same team as Andrew and Seth. One of the questions I have is, do you guys plan to allow rebinding? For example, if you create a PVC, you have a PV underneath it, you can delete the PVC and later on reclaim the PV. But this model doesn't apply to snapshot and snapshot content. In this context, do you guys have the similar consideration to PVC PV, or rather to snapshot content, which you want to maintain strong relationship, one-to-one relationship between the content and the claim?
Let me add a little bit of color to his comment, because we walked through a little bit of use case internally, and I forgot how we landed on this. But one of the things we looked at is, okay, suppose we do a greenfield provisioning of something, and now we have a bucket. And now, what if you delete the bucket but keep the content? Can you use the bucket again? But obviously, would it really be greenfield at that point? So, you know, in other words, it's kind of what's the whole flow around that? Is it assumed that you can repurpose a dynamically provisioned thing?
So let me give you my kind of gut reaction to this then. So firstly, the bucket class is defined with a we call it retain policy rather than reclaim policy, and that at the moment is just boiled down to delete and retain. Depending on those options, we do expect it to either be an actual hard delete or a retain being just removing it from the Kubernetes interface.
John, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
You only have 2 more minutes before the meeting will end.
I know we need to start paying for Zoom.
Yeah, we need to restart this later. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Not an hour meeting.
40 minutes limit for Zoom meetings.
Yeah, they're getting us.
Is that new?
That's what I get for starting.
No,
early.
it's always there. It's always
Okay.
there, unless you are using the 6 storage one. 6 storage one, you don't have this move.
So John, let me just jump in there. So
Yep.
the interesting thing here is that in the storage world, there's 2 Kubernetes layers and then the underlying bits. And the retain usually means clean up the claim but keep the PV. But that's because you can reuse the PV. It sounds like what you're saying is no, it's delete all of the Kubernetes bits or delete all of the Kubernetes bits and the underlying. Is that the case?
Yes, that's what we're thinking, Andrew. But yes, that's the current proposal and the current thinking that we've done.
Then you are not attempting to reuse the bucket content. Is the
Correct.
In the delete case, correct. In the
That's
retain
correct.
case, then I would
No, no,
imagine that'd be a brownfield
But-
operation for that.
Hold up real quick. Our stance has always been on the deletes though, is we delete the Kubernetes component. We're not actually physically deleting that bucket. Not saying we wouldn't possibly reuse it. We would treat it just like we do volume state where we're not recycling them.
Okay.
The
Right.
driver may, I mean, we call the delete, we do a gRPC call to the driver saying this is a delete case. And the driver could choose not to delete physical content, or the driver more than likely will actually delete physical content. It's up to them. But we also believe the reclaim policy can also have reuse, because we know that's a use case, reusing a bucket. And there may be erase, which means keep the name but delete content. So we see down the road other strategies for the reclaim policy, or retain policy. Sorry.
I definitely think, just to right before we get kicked out, we need a whole discussion on this.
I agree. Yeah,
Totally agree.
I'm going to
Yeah,
add this down here.
I think that needs to be a whole meeting in and of itself, Andrews.
I agree with